hand, crises are largely responsible for shaping the institutions we build. Mm-hmm. Whether you go back to the end of the Second World War and the foundation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, the Marshall Plan immediately afterwards, or the G20, which came out of the global financial crisis 2008, 2009. And so when we think about the ways this pandemic will change international institutions, the United States needs to be at the table with ideas for supporting now and rebuilding the economy in the future in a comprehensive way. And I think that's where Washington is falling short. Maybe I'll stop there because there are different elements of this. What should the role of the G7 be? What should the role of G20 be? How does the European Union's response make it a more or less reliable and significant actor in those constellations? And how do we prepare for the spread of the pandemic in developing countries? Frankly, we are all struggling to a greater or lesser degree in the most advanced economies in the world to deal with this pandemic, and we are only now starting to get a glimpse of what this will mean in countries with less wealth and less developed healthcare systems. So I think that's something that we, as an international community, and especially the advanced economy, should be thinking about. Not only because it is appropriate and compelling from a humanitarian standpoint, but also because it's going to shape the world that comes after this. So let me stop there and let's get into discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. You mentioned a lot of things. I mean, starting with the U.S. domestically, leading over to the international dimension of the crisis. We'll focus on both. Now, before we focus on that, those two aspects that are interrelated, I would like to take a step back and ask about something very mundane, maybe, but maybe not so mundane anymore because we all live in this situation now. Just for our viewers, especially in Germany, how is life at the moment in Washington, D.C.? How is it working for a renowned think tank that I mean, you've done papers in the past, you've done e-meetings in the past, but I mean, you guys, as much as we do, rely on personal meetings as well, on conferences, on exchange programs. So how much has that affected your everyday life? And how is it if we walk down Washington, D.C. Today? Do people wear masks? Do they pay attention to social distancing? Can you walk us through your everyday life and work a bit?
Well, sure. So I'm speaking to you from Northern Virginia, which is where I live. I'm in my home office, as everyone at AICGS has been doing for more than 3 weeks, and I think the experience in the rest of the think tank sector has been very similar. There is a ruling and an order by the mayor of Washington, D.C. that only essential businesses are open. So as a matter of fact, I think I would not even be allowed to go back to my office in Washington, D.C., even if I wanted to, for as long as that order stays in place. So I have not been walking the streets of Washington, but I do notice here in my own neighborhood that there is an increasing number of people wearing masks. I can't say that it is the majority, but it is a growing number. I think that what is remarkable is that Washington has been one of the most observant areas of the country when it comes to social distancing and the slowing down of travel and commuting. Part of that has to do with the fact that we are not an industrial location. So much of the work that is done in Washington is the sort of thing that can be transferred to a home office environment. So I don't think it's that we're necessarily, somehow intellectually or morally superior. It's just that the nature of the economy here is more easily transferable to a work from home situation. But I think one of the things that you mentioned which is a huge loss is the personal contact, because so much of the value that comes out of the policy world in Washington is the ability to come into contact with people from other sectors, whether it is from the legislative branch, the executive branch, or from industry, and to exchange ideas. Mm-hmm. That, of course, there is those ideas flow less smoothly when we have to switch to different channels of communicating. But I think there we are not too much different from other parts of the world, and I think in Germany you're experiencing some of the same kinds of difficulties in making life work.
Yeah, big discussion at the moment. That would be a whole different issue. I mean, you will have followed our whole discussion of what's going to happen after the magical April 19th in Germany. How is life going to change? Different topic, challenging topic, but I think we are all having similar discussions. I agree with you on that. Now, before I head back to, I wanted to take that detour into mundane everyday life before we head back to the first domestic and then global politics. One additional question maybe on AICGS is closely affiliated or belongs to Johns Hopkins University. I can see it in your backdrop.
I'll move out of the way. So
yes, Johns Hopkins, some branding exercise there. Now, transatlanticists, of course, know the university for being one of the finest in the world. Period. Those of you who are not so of us who are not so familiar with the university know it from our Corona figures that are currently being publicized. We have the World Health Organization, we have the Robert Koch Institute that publish numbers, and the university as well. It's always 2 days ahead because they have different sources. Can you just explain to us, maybe just in brief terms, not in detail, but why is the Johns Hopkins University such a central player in this crisis and in its information policy?
Well, I think first of all, Johns Hopkins University has it has one of the finest medical schools in the United States, and indeed I think in the world. And in addition to that medical school, it has always been a leader in the public health field. So that's part of the Johns Hopkins DNA, I would say, and that goes back even further than 100 years. But certainly after the influenza pandemic in 1918, 1920, that was a period where Johns Hopkins became really recognized in the United States as a leading institution for research in public health at a time when public health, infrastructure and public health thinking was at a very nascent stage. So it has been for at least a century that Johns Hopkins has been a leader on public health. I would also point out that in recent years, one particular supporter by the name of Michael Bloomberg, who is an alumnus of Johns Hopkins University. He studied engineering, not health or medicine, but he has been he has given something greater than $3 billion to Johns Hopkins University for a variety of purposes, but a large part of that has gone into the School of Public Health, which now bears Michael Bloomberg's name. It's the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So they have quite significant resources, and you see how they were able to put them to use in this pandemic. It's at a time when we are watching carefully the responses of our institutions. I think the Johns Hopkins Public Health School has been really remarkable.
Yeah, moving on. Thank you for enlightening us there. Moving on to politics. You started out by mentioning President Trump's crisis management, the federal government's crisis management, and of course, this is a topic that we need to discuss, and that I want to focus on a bit. Now, you already alluded to this, that some people have called the crisis management erratic. It started by downplaying. At some point, the president called the coronavirus crisis a democratic hoax even. Then he made announcements. They had to be retreated sometimes, and now finally, I think it's feasible, and you can really sense it. I think that the president really has grasped that something has happened and is happening, and the massive investments now, the many people affected, especially in New York City. At this point, we would like to engage the audience with a survey that we've prepared. Now, every one of you, and this will be a basis of my first discussion with Jeff. Now, I'm excited to pull up the survey. We've prepared this. We want to ask all of you, and we now are 68 people on the call. I'm going to read it out. We have that question of, will the coronavirus rather increase or rather decrease President Trump's chances for re-election? And let us maybe widen it, maybe not only chances for re-election, but maybe his general appeal. So will this really be of use to him? I think we as panelists can't vote, I'm afraid. It's just participants. And you, the audience, will have 1 minute to answer, and we will take this as a basis then to further discuss this strategy. This also fits brilliantly with a question that was just submitted by Ursula Hohmann-Assig. As you didn't submit it anonymously, I'm going to quote you on that. You asked how the rising popularity of the American president can be explained. Now we have a few seconds to go. Half of you have answered. Okay, it's over. And now would kindly ask for the results to be published. Yes, there we are. So we have 50% of all of you say that President Trump's chances for re-election will be worse than before the crisis. His erratic crisis management will reflect badly on him. 7% of you say his chances will increase because he's handling the crisis well. And 33%, so a third, say will have no significant effect at all. And then there are some people who just don't know. So roughly 50% saying it's bad crisis management and bad chances, and a third saying no effect at all. I think that fits with the general assessment that you gave at the beginning, Jeff. But still, the president's approval numbers in some polls have risen. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, you're right. They have, and I think there are maybe two. At either end of that phenomenon, I would say, first of all, there is a natural effect of solidarity in a time of crisis. The president is also much more visible in a way. He's been doing basically daily press conferences, including on weekends, for quite some time now, and he does these with his characteristic style. He will bring other officials up to the podium. He will then take, he's sort of an impresario of these events. And so there has been, I think, through this heightened visibility and a recognition that this is a serious situation, there is a tendency of people to support the authorities in power. You've seen this in previous crises, when we had the financial crisis. Or if you go back to the 2001, the September 11th attacks, and that's where I would put the other limit on this on the other pole of this, is that the bump that Trump has experienced in the polls is fairly small compared to what we've seen in other crises. George W. Bush in the early weeks after 9/11 had support in the 90% range. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Donald Trump, it has been an increase of perhaps 10 percentage points. So into the mid or upper 50s in some polls. Mm-hmm. But I think if you look at other public opinion measures, there are still, this has not been a breakthrough. I would say it has expanded somewhat, his support. The question is whether that will persist for into November, if we're thinking about this in an electoral context. But I think the other thing that's important is that if you look at the way the president has the president even said famously, I'm sure people might have heard about it, in one recent press conference, he said, I don't feel responsible, or I don't take responsibility. He has consistently, tried to shift the blame for certain things onto governors, often governors of the coastal states, which tend to be democratically controlled, and to take credit for things that that he wants to take credit for. So there is he has a way of approaching this that remains polarizing, even as he tries to tout his crisis management skills.
Yeah, that's at this point I want to pull in another follow-up question. Ute has asked whether the pandemic has the potential to overcome the polarization that you mentioned, or even increase it.
Yeah, and I think we see both tendencies thus far. On the one hand, there has been, as in the United States and really in other countries, you see it in different forms in different places. But there has been an outpouring of support for people who, for healthcare workers and other essential workers who put their safety and health on the line, and I think a recognition that these people, who in some cases are among the lowest paid participants in our economy, are actually in these days among the most important. So there are ways in which this reminds us of our shared fate. But definitely. But of course, in an election year, they are also the crisis is also a political crisis, and so we see attempts by Republicans and Democrats to frame the issues in ways that fit in an electoral context. So I think we are going to remain with divisive politics. I think it will take place in a different way than it otherwise would have. But I think if you see, the way the likely Democratic nominee Joe Biden has been responding and criticizing the president, he's been pretty direct and quite harsh in his criticism, and I think this is going to remain a characteristic of our presidential campaign for the next 7 months.
Yeah, speaking of Vice President Biden, before this crisis started, he had just overtaken Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, hugely overtaking him. And under normal circumstances, we would be talking about Biden versus Sanders and the Democratic summit approaching. Now evidently we don't talk about that at all anymore. How can one even assess how this will have an effect on the, let's say, procedural rules of the presidential election? Not even political positions, but will this kind of postpone the whole process and maybe slow down the political process as it stands at the moment?
It's certainly slowing certain things down. The Democratic Party has postponed their national convention, which was supposed to take place in July. That's been postponed further into the fall. There's even some question about whether it would happen in person or whether there would have to be some other arrangement instituted. So there is definitely an effect of slowing down the decision process. I think it's pretty clear that Joe Biden is on a trajectory to win the nomination. Nothing really has changed in the last month that would change that prediction. But Bernie Sanders has not stepped out of the race, and so that leaves some uncertainty. But increasingly, Joe Biden is acting as if he were already the nominee, because he's focusing not on competition with Bernie Sanders, which he has basically won, but on the president. Now, what we also have going on, though, in this, and this is significant as we look at the possible if the pandemic continues into the fall, you see fights happening in the states now, which are supposed to be holding their presidential primary elections, including today in the state of Wisconsin, where even until last night, there was a fight between the Republican-controlled legislature, if I'm not mistaken, the Democratic governor of Wisconsin, the state Supreme Court, and the federal Supreme Court about whether and under what circumstances that primary election could be held. And so I think we're going to see these kinds of battles in the individual states that have primaries left to happen, and over the possibility of expanding things like voting by mail, early voting, and other measures that, from a public health perspective, would limit the risk, but that in some cases would mean new procedures would be needed that Democrats and Republicans would, in most cases, have to agree on, where you don't have the governance in one party's hands. So I think that is going to be the new battleground for the next several months. Who gets to participate in this election? How easy or difficult is it to participate? And where do the parties see their advantages? And then do the courts get involved if there are if it starts to impinge on the fundamental fairness of the electoral process? So I think we have a lot of that ahead of us.
Yeah, maybe also, until 2 months ago, we talked a lot about, at every election context, we talked about gerrymandering. Maybe that adds another dimension to the whole procedural electoral process. One last question on domestic politics before we move on to the international dimension. We have excellent audience participation here. I'm juggling between excellent submissions, and I want to quote, because you mentioned the public health sector. That's, of course, a Pandora's box that I could be opening now or could not. It's a topic of its own. But your colleague Peter Rosenbaum from New York City, from the University Alliance, Ruhr University Alliance, he asks now, with the tremendous weakness, as he calls it, of the U.S. healthcare system at the moment, do you think, and do you assess that the whole question of a centralized healthcare system will come to the center stage again? So will this affect the whole public or private, and how do we organize healthcare system at large?
Yeah, well, that's, I will not pretend to be an expert on public health, but it is clear that one of the problems in the United States there are two problems. One was the difficulty in expanding our testing capacity as quickly as other countries were able to do, and that, there are some bureaucratic reasons that seem apparent, but that was a failure of public health authorities, it seems to me. The question about the structure of our health system, I think that's also becoming apparent to, if it wasn't apparent already, is that we still have large numbers of uninsured people. And it means that people, in some cases, are unwilling to seek treatment, or they are harder to identify. And if you are blind, because people are not willing to enter into the healthcare system because they don't think they can afford it, then that blindness makes it harder to deal with an epidemic. So that much is clear. Whether the the response will include expanded access and a change in the American healthcare system is a big question on which I think we're going to have a lot of political debate, but it's hard for me to predict how that's going to turn out.
No, I understand that. It was unfair, of course. That's the same question. That's the same niveau as who's going to win the election. So I'm going to move on to multinational cooperation. And we have another survey that I want to pull up at this point. It's on multinational cooperation. Now, will this pull up? Yes, it's working beautifully. Let me share a secret. When we tested this half an hour ago, it didn't work. Now it's working. That's perfect. I'm gonna read it out for you, and you can all answer. Will the coronavirus strengthen or weaken multinational cooperation? with obvious options being it will strengthen the multinational system, it will weaken, and states will pursue a us first policy, like America first, Germany first, and so on. What's interesting at the moment, you can't see this, but I can. The two bars are really battling. It's we've had movements back and forth. It's not over yet, but we have a very, very tense battle between yes and no. And I mean, Jeff, I can already jump there. From your assessment in the beginning, you were rather critical, or very critical, of the international cooperation level in this crisis. Now people seem to be indecisive here. We can stop it, I think, and publish the results. So can we stop it? Yes, I'm gonna try. Katharina stopped it and publish it. So 33%, so a perfect third, says the international system, multinational system, will be strengthened by this crisis, and 45%, a bit more, say the system will be weakened. So is that an optimistic outlook to you, Jeff? Do we as internationalists maybe not see a certain aspect? Why are people so optimistic on a relative scale?
Well, on the other hand, I mean, 45% are saying it will weaken multinationalism. So perhaps that's also significant. I think the thing that is you have a debate happening in the United States, but also I notice in Germany and elsewhere about the risks of globalization. Now, there are some, including some people around President Trump, who pursue this, who have had a single-minded anti-globalization focus from the time that Trump was elected, and even before. But even if you don't take that to an extreme, I think there is clearly, the integrated value chains and have led, and the efficiencies that globalization has brought have led to a phenomenon where we now have, for example, in the United States, we are dependent on medical active ingredients, basically from China and from India. When it comes to personal protective equipment for the medical field, most of that comes from China. So it doesn't mean that globalization is per se bad, but that for certain circumstances, at least, you need to have redundancies and stockpiles that are sufficient to deal with a crisis. And so I think that is one clear indication that comes out of this crisis, is that there is a need for, if you want to talk about this in terms of societal resilience, that there is a need for more redundancy, and how much more will depend on the field and the industry. But I think that is one effect. And then, but some people in the United States try to take that to an extreme and say that it is an indictment of globalization, and therefore the so-called decoupling argument between the United States and China should come up. Again, I don't think that is a wise path to pursue, but it is increasingly a framework within which people see it. I noticed the comments of the Chancellor just yesterday, I believe, in which she, in a much milder form, addressed this question without giving an answer, but simply acknowledging that this is an issue. And I think that's something that's going to happen all across the world as we think about how we change our procedures, what safety we need to build into the market efficiencies that we will still need to pursue in a globalized world.
Yeah, we have a follow-up question on that from Hartmut Trommershausen, who asks if the allocation of medtech material isn't a major problem here. I'm paraphrasing this, or I'm actually going to read it. And wouldn't global acting companies be more efficient to allocate the material where it is needed, instead of local governments that might not have a good overview of the location of the needed goods? Yeah, good question.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think if we look at the United States, this has been one of the consistent criticisms that Democrats have made toward Trump and the administration, that they have been shy about using the legal authorities they have in an emergency to direct production of certain key goods. Now, this was thought of, in the post World War II era as a for a military emergency, for an international security emergency, but the president has used those authorities to a limited extent, but mainly for ventilators and relatively late, and not with regard to personal medical protective equipment. Mm-hmm. So I think, but it's clear that there needs to be in a state of emergency, there needs to be the emergency authorities, and they need to be used, and they need to be practiced. I think this is another thing that it reminds us. Governance is a skill that states build and have to maintain. Mm-hmm. And I think this what this pandemic has exposed is the failure to devote sufficient resources to maintaining these emergency capabilities. The U.S. military spends a lot of time exercising and training in order to be prepared for a crisis. We don't have the same degree of preparedness, consciousness, and culture in the rest of the federal government. In my experience, we had a wake-up call with Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. About 15 years ago, and we've had improvement in our federal emergency management agency, and including with some of the hurricanes that had to deal with in recent years. But this is something that we were not well exercised for.
Mm. Yeah, this ties in with another. I'm really excited about all of these questions that are popping in. Ursula Hohmann-Assig asking if this maybe wasn't the time when the US could have assumed a leading position, not in terms of a military leader, but as a healthcare leader. I think you will agree to that.
Well, and I think this isn't an either or. Now, there's not really this is not a crisis that has a military dimension, although there may be equipment and capacities which the military can make available to civilian authorities. The sort of Amtshilfe idea, which of course the Bundeswehr is doing as well. But basically, you need to be able to do all of these things. And I think one area where the United States could make proposals would be for strengthened international preparedness for the next pandemic, for example. And there's a role for international institutions to play there, of course. There is the World Health Organization, but there is also plenty of room, I think, for the United States and other developed countries to pool their experience, to draw the lessons from it, and to make that available to countries that need it, as well as being prepared ourselves for the next pandemic or the next civil emergency, whatever that might be.
Oh my God, you're saying it again. The next pandemic. We're already thinking about the next one, but it's logical. It's gonna come at some point. We now have roughly 8 minutes. I'm being very German. 8 minutes left for this full hour to end, and we could talk forever. But let's make it graspable for everyone. We have some questions here. I can just invite you to now's your time. If you haven't committed yet to asking a question, now's your time to either raise your hands. So there's a button down there. Raise your hand, or submit a question via Q&A. I'm going to continue with one last question that I would like to ask. And if you're ready, just let us know. I wanna move to the question of let's say global populism in a sense. AICGS senior fellow Eric Langenbacher, he wrote an article I think a week ago or so, asking and answering the question: has the coronavirus pandemic broken the populist fever? Now, Eric gave a slightly positive answer in that respect and said, yes, but. I understood it that he wrote, yes, but if populists are not in power, they don't have anything to say at the moment. But then again, we have certain governments that could be called populist at the moment that are in power that maybe could win by this crisis. What's your take on that? How do you see the future of democratic societies globally?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is one of the most important questions when we look at how this this international emergency will change our politics and internally, but then also internationally. There are plenty of examples you can point to where you see, for example, in Hungary, the Viktor Orban taking advantage of the pandemic to basically neutralize and turn Hungary more or less into an autocracy. And so I think that is a deeply disturbing development that plenty of his admirers or his fellow statesmen may observe carefully and may try to replicate. So I think a crisis of this sort has the potential to be exploited to expand authoritarian control in places where it is already present. I think, though, when you look at the changes, for example, in Germany, if you look at the public opinion, at least at this stage, you see a consolidating effect around the CDU-CSU. To a certain degree, that has benefited the Social Democratic Party, depending on which polls you look at, but to a much lesser degree. You see a plateau and perhaps even a decline in support for the Greens, who had been almost approaching parity with the CDU in public opinion 2 months ago. Now there is a gap of, in some cases, 20 points. At least in one poll I saw, it was, I think, 38% for the CDU-CSU and 18% for the Greens. Whereas before that was a difference of 3 or 4 or 5 percentage points. So that, I think, is, the AfD in that context has fallen into the single digits. So I think in the particular circumstances of Germany, you see a flight to competence and to reassurance of effective administration. That, I think, right now, when you have a sense of everybody being in it together, is dominating. Mm-hmm. But I think we all remember, where the AfD's support came from during the migration crisis, and that set in only later, when there was discontent about the costs and the effect of migration. So I think it may be a little too early to say that this will definitely lead to that this will break the back of populism. If you look at Italy, where you have great discontent, in particular discontent with Italy's European partners, and you see Matteo Salvini and the Lega, working very hard to exploit that sense of disappointment and to turn it into political support. So I think this will be a battlefield. Political battlefield where Democrats and with a small d, with all people who support democratic systems, need to be shaping and participating in the debate and not leaving the field to those who want to exploit frustrations for political gain.
Yeah, one follow-up on that, maybe one semi-final one. You mentioned the global migration crisis, a discourse around starting in Germany, of course, in 2015, and the rise of populism in Germany. So far, that whole discourse hasn't been connected to the coronavirus pandemic yet. I can imagine this may change at a point where it's not unthinkable that a pandemic will develop or will break out in a refugee camp. Do you think that happening anytime soon? Discursively, to me, it seems so almost logical in a populist sense to join these discourses, but it hasn't happened yet. Luckily, how do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's from the, again, I'm not a public health expert, but it seemed from the point of view of public health that the circumstances where people are living, whether it is in Syria or in Turkey or in other places where you have large numbers of refugees and displaced persons, those are much more favorable circumstances for the spread of a virus like the coronavirus. So I think it's inevitable that is going to happen somewhere, but then the question of how that connects to but it may not necessarily happen in Germany if we're thinking about it as a driver of populism. I think the other thing that strikes me about the difference between the migration crisis 2015 and how it was the political impact it had, and the current one is that, to put it quite bluntly, the people who are being affected are all of your neighbors potentially. And I think that has a sobering effect when it comes to the ways that you can exploit an emergency situation for political gain. At least again in the German context, where it requires great efforts, but the system is dealing with that situation. When the situation fails to deal with when the system fails to deal with the situation, then you have the potential for the exploitation of the political issue, and I think that's what we're seeing in Italy now, where there's already been a fairly high degree of frustration in public opinion predating the pandemic. Frustration with the European Union, so there are antecedents that clearly are playing into it now.
Yeah, this would be another topic, talking about the EU dimension of the crisis. We've touched it, but unfortunately we are running out of time, or have run out of time. And the day has just started in Washington, D.C. I don't want to keep you from your important work any longer. I want to thank you very, very much, Jeff, for doing this with us, for enlightening us with your insights, and for being our first speaker on the first edition of Transatlantic Voices, Stimmen aus Amerika in Zeiten von Corona. We can't clap here, but I think maybe we have to invent metaphors for clapping in Zoom. I think maybe imagining a full room applauding.
Well, Benjamin, I want to thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity to talk with so many people. I want to thank Katarina as well. Sorry we can't see you personally, but glad to. For all of the support and for making this work so well. And I want to just encourage everybody who's out there. We have, like many other think tanks, we have tried to step up our output of analysis and digital content. So please visit AICGS.org. You can listen to our podcast. You can read our analysis and commentary. And we always welcome feedback and look forward to these kinds of opportunities to remain in touch, even when we are distant.
Yeah, I can just reiterate that and piggyback on that, and in closing say that we are now planning on doing these videos regularly with experts from the US, from various backgrounds, various regions, on various subtopics. Next week, for example, we will have a cooperative webinar with the American Chamber of Commerce in Germany on the American and German government's relief packages. This will take place on Thursday, April 16th at 5:15 p.m. German time with legal and entrepreneurial experts from the US and Germany. Invitation will follow tomorrow. So let's wrap it up. Let's stay connected in these challenging times and be assured we will be back digitally and once time allows again in presence as well. Until then, be safe, stay healthy, and happy Easter.
Thanks very much, Amerika Haus.
Thank you.